So this Sunday is the last Sunday. I'm going to talk about stewardship for a while. And we've been journeying over the last 3 weeks with different aspects of our lives and how we give them to God, how we offer them to God. We started out a couple of Sundays ago talking about the inheritance of our faith, which has been given to us by generations before, and which we have a responsibility to be stewards of by helping it to grow, by taking care of it and nurturing it. But also, most importantly, by passing it along to subsequent generations so that the church may continue alive and vital. For the church, if it fails just one generation to pass that faith along, will disappear. Then last week we talked about how we steward the talents and the gifts and the capacities of our lives for God. We talked about the importance of discerning those gifts. What are the gifts and talents that God has placed in my life? And how do I deploy those gifts in the world? What do I do to put those gifts into functionality and service for God and for the church? And for all of humanity, for that matter. And how do I go about continuing to develop those gifts, not allowing them to grow stale and useless? Today I want to talk about how we use our material resources. How do we use the goods that come to us as a part of our labor, as a part of our life? How do we dedicate those to God? Now, preaching from Leviticus is always something of a scary proposition. Because Leviticus is like Numbers and Deuteronomy. All of those books carry this enormous corpus of rules and regulations that got laid out and set out in ancient times for Israel, for the people to follow. And there's tons and tons of stuff in Leviticus that we absolutely and utterly disregard today. For example, does anybody here have a cotton poly shirt on by chance? Cotton polyester, or cotton rayon, or cotton, yeah. It is against God's law to put anything on you that has two different fabrics in it. So, lawbreakers. Anybody like shellfish in this congregation? Camaroncitos? Anybody like those shrimp cocktails with the guacamole and the avocado? No, no, no. How about tacos de carnitas or tacos al pastor? Yes. Yeah. All right, you get the idea, all right? There's all kinds of stuff in this book of Leviticus that is problematic. So, when I talk to you about all the laws around tithing, which is one of the things that is in Leviticus, I want you to understand that I'm not doing that to beat people up, all right? That's not my intention at all. I will not use that book to beat people up because I think it's a very, very painful and poor use of the Scripture to do that. I want to use it to explain to us how we got to where we are in terms of the way in which we do church and need the support of the community to sustain a building and a pastor for the life of the church community. Because it hasn't always been that way. But it actually did kind of start out that way. And so I want to tell you that history and how it's changed over time and how it's changing right now. Because I think we're going to have some choices to make. Not just our congregation, but the church as a whole is having to make some new choices about how we do things. And we may find ourselves in that situation before very long. We'll see. So, long ago, when Israel had finished wandering in the wilderness after coming out of slavery and learning how to depend upon God in the wilderness, they came into the promised land, finally under Joshua's leadership. And as they come into the promised land, and God kind of helps them displace all these people who used to live there. And God finally says, okay, now it's time. Excuse me. I have a kind of a raspy throat. I'm trying to take care of it. Now God says, all right, you have this land now, and this is what we're going to do. Well, there's 12 tribes of Israel. And so kind of like the Reyes Católicos granted land grants to Mexican settlers who came across the ocean and needed land, and they said, this is going to be the Territorio Vasquez, and this is going to be the Territorio Torres. And people got a land grant that was theirs to occupy and to use, to produce. Well, Joshua distributed the land among the 12 tribes, and each of the tribes got a chunk of land that was theirs to take care of, with one exception. Levi's tribe, the tribe of Levites, got no land whatsoever. No land. Why? They were the priests who served the tabernacle, which was the place of worship as they traveled through the desert, and which would be their place of worship until a temple was built under Solomon's leadership many, many, many generations later. And so the Levites were not allowed to work the land. Their job was to serve God and the people through the worship apparatus of the tabernacle. So how did they survive? They survived because there was a tax called the tithe that was instituted among all the other 11 tribes. Those tribes, every one of them, every individual, every family, had to take a tenth of what their land produced, whether it was animals or crops, and bring it to the tabernacle, to the Levites, so that they had something to eat. Otherwise, they wouldn't. And that was how the system worked. The 11 tribes supported the 12th tribe that was dedicated to serving God and the community through the cultic practice around the tabernacle. Now, there were some other kinds of offerings. There were offerings called the first fruit offerings. So at the beginning of the harvest, or when the lambing or baby goats came into season, the very first goat born to a mama goat, or the very first lamb born to a mama lamb, mama sheep, was to be given to God, a holy sacrifice. It was dedicated wholly to the Lord. It was also true of human beings. The first child that opened the womb was given to God. But in the case of humans, you could redeem your child by paying a certain amount, 5 shekels of silver, and then you could get your kid back, not have to give them to God, all right, in that kind of way. So, first fruits of the harvest. When it was time for the grain harvest, the very first sheaf of grain that's pulled together and bound up is taken to the tabernacle and given as an offering to God. Then there were all kinds of other sacrifices, the sin offerings and the guilt offerings and the thank offerings, all of those different offerings that came in. Part of them went to the fire to be burned up, and part of them went to the priests and the Levite community so that they would have grain for their families, meat for their tables, drink for their tables as well. So that was the system. It was called a tithing system, and that's where the name tithe comes from, because it is a tenth. A tithe is a tenth of everything that you produce. Now, that system stayed intact up until the Babylonians came in and destroyed the temple. And they all got taken away to Babylon. And there was no temple. Levites couldn't do anything. Levites had to learn how to work like everybody else did in Babylon. And then after 70 years or so, everybody comes back. And after a while, they're able to build a temple again. And then things kind of got back to normal. And the Levites were again the tribe that did not work the land, but that worked the temple. And that stayed true all the way up into Jesus' day. And so in Jesus' day, people brought their their tax, their tenth, in so that the Levites' families had something to eat. Now, in 70 AD, the Romans finally got tired of the Jews and their constant rebellions. And they swooped into Jerusalem and utterly destroyed everything that was there. The temple and everything in it. They destroyed the crop. They destroyed the entire Palestinian area because they were just astaka with the rebellions of the Jewish people. From that time forward, the Jews have not had a temple, and the Levites have not served in that capacity. Well, there is a little overlap between that happening and the Christian church beginning. Because Jesus died somewhere in the mid-30s, and the church comes into being under the umbrella of Judaism. Christians were considered a sect, a subset of Judaism for that entire first generation. But the Christians began poking their noses out into the Gentile world among Romans and Greeks. And so while there was this beginning underneath the umbrella of Judaism, which had that temple practice of giving tithes, right? Very quickly, within the first generation of the church, all that disappeared. And when that disappeared, the Romans hated the Jews and hated Christians because they were considered Jews for a big piece of that time. The Jews could not do the sacrificial system anymore. They were persona non grata, and the Christians, because they were considered part of that Jewish community, had to go underground. And so they did. They did not meet in sanctuaries like this for 300 years. 300 years. No sanctuaries at all for the Christian community. Where did they meet? They met in Helen's house, and Edma's house, and Jason's house, and Janet's house. And the pastors of the community were Janet and Jason and Helen and Mueller. They're the ones who pastored the communities. And there were some itinerating apostles who went around to visit those communities, but there was not a clergy class. There was not a separate group that got specially educated. As people demonstrated the awareness and capacity for study of the Word and an understanding of the tradition, then they took on roles as teachers within their local communities. But the church, a church, would not be as big as we are. This would be about the size of a church in a community. It would be a house church that met in somebody's house. That's how the church lived for about 300 years. And they had to, because they couldn't be public or they would be persecuted. It was necessary for them to live in that kind of way. Well, things changed with one very momentous event. Constantine, the emperor of Rome, in around the early 300s, became a Christian. And when he became a Christian, he created an edict that granted religious liberty to Christians for the first time in 300 years. And for the first time in 300 years, Christians had the chance to gather together publicly. Well, where did they do that? Every community had a public meeting hall that was called a basilica. We think of the word basilica and we think of, little flower basilica. That's not what a basilica looked like. A basilica looked a whole lot like this building right here, without the pews, and with one big chair up on a raised platform. The magistrate of the community would sit in the chair, and the people would stand for the audience and have the public meeting, whatever it was. So when the church began to have access to that public space, the people stood, and who would sit in the chair? Well, whoever the community leader was. Sometimes men, sometimes women. And they would lead the community's prayer time. Up until then, the circle was the image of the church gathered. Once this happened, all of a sudden, the very architecture of the basilica began to create a separate class. The teacher was elevated, and the people were down low. A little bit later, Constantine's mother, who was quite wealthy, began to build churches in Palestine on holy sites that were reverenced by Christians over the generations. This plate and these cups, which I brought back from Israel for us, depict the oldest mosaic created in a Christian church on the planet, at least that we know about. It was created, the church was built, and the mosaic was built right in front of the stone upon which Christians had reverenced the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus blessed the bread and the fish. And they built a church around that site. Constantine's mom did. And she commissioned this fish and loaves design to be in the mosaic right there. Up until then, there were not buildings dedicated just to Christian worship. So the church didn't have to support them, didn't have to maintain them, didn't have to pay to have them built, didn't have to pay to have them repaired, didn't have to do any of that. And the leaders were husbands and wives and folks who had homes that they made available to the church. They didn't get paid to do that. They simply opened their home up and shared with the community. There was not a formal paid clergy until much later. But eventually, what happened over time is that the church kind of readopted the model of the Levites. As buildings were built, somebody had to take care of them. Somebody had to be responsible for that, for at least coordinating it and organizing it. Somebody had to pay for it. And as the church was able to grow bigger, the needs of the church grew greater. The needs for pastoral care. It couldn't just happen among, 20 folks who gathered and all knew each other. Not everybody might know each other as the church has got larger and larger. And before long, there developed a paid clergy who dedicated themselves full-time to the work of caring for the buildings and caring for the people. And that's kind of how we got to where we are today. The systems changed and adapted in various ways, and the way you pay for those clergy has changed and is different from denomination to denomination and even within the denomination. For example, in Scotland today, in the Church of Scotland that we come from, every church member is taxed a certain amount. And they give that to not the individual congregation, but the presbytery. And the presbytery distributes that money equally to every pastor that is serving another church. So all the pastors are paid pretty much the same amount of money, whether they're in First Presbyterian Church or Divine Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Different system. We have more of a free agent system in our reality. In the Waldensian Church down in South America, they do a very similar thing, only they kind of take into consideration the cost of living in a community and whether a pastor has family members to support or is single. And so they have a formula they use to distribute those resources based on the actual needs of the family and the pastor. Not a different system. In the Catholic Church, it's all gathered up and it's all held in common, and the church administers that and pays for the needs of the clergy. Different ways to deal with it. But what we're discovering today, in this particular moment in the United States, in the churches like ours, is that church membership is declining, cost of living is increasing, And most churches our size or smaller have right now the last full-time pastor that they will see. Because what it costs to support a pastor is more than the few members in the church are able to give. That's where we are in the church today. So what that means is things are going to change. Things are going to change. Either we figure out how to grow so that we have enough people to support pastors if we want to have full-time pastors, or we begin to move back to a model that is closer to what happened during the first centuries of the church, where the leadership is lay, perhaps not as educated, perhaps not as much training, because that training is costly. And people who invest in it need to make enough money to be able to do that. We may go back to a tent-making model like the Apostle Paul, who earned his living by sewing canvases for sails and for tents, and then traveled around and did his preaching in an itinerant way. It's not clear exactly where that's going. But right now in our congregation's life, we're at that point. So we're struggling to support our budget. We can't really cover just from our members' contributions the costs of maintaining what we are doing as a church right now in terms of staffing and programming. We're not bringing that in. And so we are in that balance. And we got to figure out which way we're going to go. And it's our choice. It's our choice. We either are going to figure out how to grow so that we can collect enough to support what we do, or we're going to tip to a place where we can't support a full-time pastor. In which case, it's going to be different. It's going to be different. So, I don't want to say one of those is good and one of those is bad, because they both have served the church. Both of those models have served the church at different times. And they're both valid ways to do ministry. But we're at a place where we're going to have to figure that out together, what we're going to do. And I bring that history to you so that you don't experience that decision as a choice between, as a choice that we failed somehow. If we decide that we can't do a full-time pastor piece, if we can't do that, that's okay. It just means we're in a different place. But if we decide we really want to take the time and make the effort to figure out how to grow so that we can support it, that's okay too. But it's not like one of those is righteous and one of those is not. They're both good options, but they're different options that have served the church very well in different times and parts of history. So, we've got a long tradition that is varied, that is grounded in the understanding that the earth, the land belongs to God and everything in it. And so all that we have, all that we earn, all that we grow, all that we are belongs to God. And so some of that belongs to God and we need to give it back. Because that's the way we show God that we recognize it all belongs to God. But whether we decide we need a dedicated building to worship in together, or decide to worship in homes, or use spaces like basilicas or public schools or other meeting halls to be the place where we worship so we don't have to maintain a building constantly, that's a choice we can make. Whether we decide to have a full-time pastor who's dedicated to helping administer those things and administer program and do teaching and all that, or whether we decide to split all that up and each of us become teachers of different pieces or pastors to different groups of people within the church, it's going to be our choice. But it's in our hands, and it's all in God's hands, just like the church has been from the beginning. It's not like God abandoned the church early on when they had to meet in houses and have pastors who were the heads of households. not like God was only with the church when we were, busting at the seams and had plenty of people, more need for ministers than we had people being churned out by our seminaries. No. God is with us now just as God was with us then. And God will be with us as we move forward. I have no doubt about that. God will carry the church into whatever the church needs to be. But that's where we are. And I just need us all to understand it. Because that's where we are. And I'm trusting and I'm confident that God will do something good. I just don't know what it is yet. And I hope that we can discover it together. Let's pray. God, thank you for everything that you have given to us. Thank you for all of the ways in which you have blessed us. For the inheritance that you have given us in our time and our day, of faith, of talent, of treasure. And thank you for the responsibility to be stewards of that for the coming generations. Give us wisdom that we may know what it is that you call us to be and to do today. So that this faith that we cherish, this relationship with you that we have known in Jesus, can be shared with those who come after us. For in his name we pray.